the first half of this is a no-brainer. Obviously, figure out what content your folks are consuming. I remember at one point I was representing a client that was selling an enterprise knowledge management software, right? So I had no idea what that was. Like with many of our startup technology clients at Foresight, going into it, I had no knowledge about the persona, the industry, the product, the technology, anything, right? And the first step for me was always to be like, okay, what is, first of all, like Google some of the very basic terms and be humble. It helps me to be humble because I don't have a piece of paper on my wall, right? So Google all of the dumb terms and all of the things you don't know. And then from there you can be like, okay, so this is related to knowledge management. What are some good knowledge management forums? What are some good LinkedIn groups? What are some good newsletters, right? Start subscribing to things, and especially on LinkedIn, since I spend still so much of my day on LinkedIn. That's a really easy way where once you start curating your channels, you'll just casually get content around it, right? And then you can start learning things as you go. You just casually consuming that light content. But the biggest education piece for me, especially coming from Foresight, was cold calling. Even to this day, I'm not afraid of assuming the role of the dunce, somebody who doesn't know, doesn't understand like the joke, doesn't get the phrase, doesn't understand the concept, right? There are still many times when somebody says something to me, and at this point people talk to me like I'm a peer, and there's still many times where they say something like, oh, you know how it is when there's like a reorg at the top and then leadership gets all kind of scrambled. And there's some times where I'm like, I don't actually what do you mean by reorg? What do you mean by scramble? Like, I actually don't know what you're talking about. Can you can you help me understand a little bit? Asking my prospects for clarification on whatever they were talking about, and it does take a little bit of vulnerability to do that. That was the single biggest educational source I had for business acumen and for sounding like my peers and for sounding like a peer to my prospects.
Hello. Welcome to another episode of the Revenue Podcast. I'm Ethan Parker and Brendan Dodge with me here as always. And today we have an interview with our good friend, Rob. Wow. I already messed up in the opener for the episode. Rod Baptista. I was combining first name, last name. Account executive over at ZoomInfo, which are also good friends of ours. And I'm really excited to have this interview with Rod. He's has a really long background as being a really great SDR too. And so we're going to talk about some of those things and that transition into AE role. But Rod, how you doing today, man?
It's cold, man. It's cold in Maryland this morning, and I'm doing good. It's we're getting the quarter heated up already.
It's not cold in Charleston, but I'm going back and forth between freezing and sweating because I'm flu or COVID or some combination of all the above. So I feel you. Brendan, is it cold where you're
at? Slightly. It was raining and pouring yesterday, but feels like a spring day outside, but more on the colder side.
Enjoy it.
Currently sunny.
All right. Well, let's dig in on a few things. So, Rod, one of the most interesting things that I think when I was doing some homework for this episode, I know you're really big on cold calls, and so am I. But before we kind of dig into that, because I think you have some good stuff there. I heard you talk about Jason and some other folks you chatted with about this, so I think it'd be interesting. But one thing you mentioned is you view yourself as a professional SDR, even as now in the AE role, which I love that. And you also mentioned that you think everyone can be in sales, and while those are two different thoughts, I think one kind of speaks to the other. But when you say you view yourself as a professional SDR, how do you think that, or I guess why do you feel that way? And how do you think that served you in the AE role? Because I see this as a huge asset when people are making the move from go to SDR to AE to be able to self-source and maintain those principles. And maybe anything you've learned, maybe where you had some challenges kind of maintaining that mindset as you start to work some deal cycles and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's true. I guess I see myself as a professional SDR because that's my formative background, right? Relative to my peers, I don't have a bachelor's degree. So the only thing I have that really sets me aside and brings value to the work that I do is the years that I've spent as an SDR and the years that I've spent learning how to be an amazing SDR at Foresight, a company that developed their own proprietary cold calling methodology. right? So I took that on myself. I really see that that's the value that I bring to the table. And that's how I've been able to compete with people that have a better educational background than I do, because I'm able to, even as an AE, I still know how to, I'm still calling, I'm still sourcing my own meetings. And a lot of the things I did as an SDR, which I think you're going to ask me about in terms of asking questions, really translate into the discovery piece of being an AE.
Yeah, I think it translates uncannily that people don't even see or think about. I think that's also why it's so important to have your outbound lined up with like your discovery methodology, and to prevent some of that. Somebody coming in this meeting and, well, yeah, person asked me all the same questions, do this. I still haven't seen the product 2 minutes later, that kind of, that type of thing. Right. So I think it's super important. Yeah, there's so many things I want to drill in there, but before maybe we talk about some of the actual prospecting side, you mentioned you don't have like a degree like some of your peers, bachelor's degree, whatever. Me neither. And so I dropped out of school. I had a 4.0. I'm a really good test taker, but I saw like zero value in what I was doing. I wasn't learning anything that I felt was useful. I felt like, I was already like getting into sales, and I was like making a good bit of money, like doing 20 hours a week. And I was like, man, fuck this, dude. If I just put 40, 50, 60 hours a week into this, like, what do I need to go to school for? But I'm curious. One of the biggest struggles I see with like SDRs going to the AE is like the business acumen piece of, what you kind of just alluded to, and how you ask questions on cold calls, and then how that translates into a discovery call. But I don't know. Let's start with like, how if you found to be most helpful in terms, like if you're a new SDR and you're trying to learn a little bit more about your personas, the industry you're selling into, what have you found to be helpful and like kind of helping you build more of the acumen that some people associate with, oh, they need to go to school and they need to do this, and like I think that's total BS, man. I've seen so many people go to college and then can't ask discovery questions worth of shit. But just for argument's sake, would love to get your take.
Yeah. And the first half of this is a no-brainer. Obviously, figure out what content your folks are consuming. I remember at one point I was representing a client that was selling an enterprise knowledge management software, right? So I had no idea what that was. Like with many of our startup technology clients at Foresight, going into it, I had no knowledge about the persona, the industry, the product, the technology, anything, right? And the first step for me was always to be like, okay, first of all, like Google some of the very basic terms, and be humble. It helps me to be humble because I don't have a piece of paper on my wall, right? So Google all of the dumb terms and all of the things you don't know, and then from there you can be like, okay, oh, so this is related to knowledge management. What are some good knowledge management forums? What are some good LinkedIn groups? What are some good newsletters, right? Start subscribing to things, and especially on LinkedIn, since I spend still so much of my day on LinkedIn. That's a really easy way where once you start curating your channels, you'll just casually get content around it, right? And then you can start learning things as you go. You just casually consuming that light content. But the biggest education piece for me, especially coming from Foresight, was cold calling, right? I even to this day, I'm not afraid of assuming the role of the dunce, somebody who doesn't know, that doesn't understand like the joke, doesn't get the phrase, doesn't understand the concept, right? There are still many times when somebody says something to me, and at this point people talk to me like I'm a peer, and there's still many times where they say something like, oh, you know how it is when there's like a reorg at the top and then leadership gets all kind of scrambled. And there's some times where I'm like, I don't actually, what do you mean by reorg? What do you mean by scrambled? Like, I actually don't know what you're talking about. Can you can you help me understand a little bit? Asking my prospects for clarification on whatever they were talking about, and it does take a little bit of vulnerability to do that. That was the single biggest educational source I had for business acumen and for sounding like my peers and for sounding like a peer to my prospects.
That's such a huge one. So many people are afraid to say they don't know, and it gets you in so much trouble. That's interesting because I'm sure I'm sure everybody has heard something like that on the phone. They say, "Oh, I'm sure we're going through this, that, and the other," and then the answer 99.9% of the time from the seller from that is, "Oh yeah, man, I know how it is," and you have the slightest fucking clue what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You've never been a VP of sales and dealing with your C-suite being shuffled around and this, that, and the other. That's a good one. I love that. To sum that up, on the phone, getting feedback from prospects, being vulnerable, asking when you don't know, just saying you don't know and asking them for clarification. So powerful. Love that. Content, forums, LinkedIn, wherever they might be, kind of, newsletters, whatever content your prospects consume. I would throw one more thing on top of this for everyone listening. Is what I really like to do, as well as leveraging LinkedIn, is messaging, your target personas and just kind of asking them, hey, what podcast do you listen to? Where do you find content relevant to your position? I'm just trying to learn a bit more. You mind sharing, what your favorites are? And if you shoot 5, 6, 7, 10 of those messages out, you will get a good bit of content recommendations that you can go, take a peek at. And that just it's like a puzzle that when you solve it, opens the door to more puzzles. It just goes down a rabbit hole and just find more things.
And that's such a great practice in general. There's an old saying where if you ask for money, you'll get advice. And if you ask for advice, you'll get money. So sometimes even just asking people like, hey, I know you're a thought leader. I'd love to know just what podcast you're consuming. Sometimes that could lead into a meeting or an opportunity even, right?
Yeah, it does. It's very true. I was just having this conversation with a mentor around a fundraising topic. So it's very true. Very true. Cool. So I love that piece. Now let's dig into the cold calling part, Rock. I know this is something that, you guys, you do well, and you guys did, really well when you were back at Vorsight, right? So before we talk about the technicals, I guess, can you tell me a little bit more about how you spend or prioritize time around dials, if you do at all, or if you even think about it in that way? But one thing that I hear a lot from other, especially AEs, and maybe you can add in how this has been different for you from SDR to AE, is managing time around prospecting. Hey, I don't have the time to make 50 dials a day anymore like I used to. So I have my own opinion, thoughts how you can prioritize this, but I guess how do you think about working this in? Is it no different than when the SDRs, you have your calls built into your steps? Are you using triggers? Are you doing something else, creative to kind of prioritize who you're calling? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. I'll attack that question from a process and a technology perspective. And it's so interesting to me, having been an SDR at a couple different companies and having worked closely with AEs at lots of different companies. It's interesting to me how a lot of times for an SDR role, you'll create, I'll put it this way. It's very common to find in companies the process and technology component for being able to just have a list that you can call down, right? At Vorsight, we used to do it directly off of Salesforce, which is kind of novel. At different companies, sometimes they have you calling directly off of Outreach, or maybe sometimes even just an Excel sheet, whatever. But having a list you can use where as soon as you open it, okay, here's that person, I'm going to call them. It doesn't take any thought process, right? That was huge as an SDR, and obviously dials are your biggest sort of activity metric as an SDR, basically, whatever. I've seen a lot that sometimes as when you progress into an AE role, there's a lot of focus around technologies and process for building opportunities, for building reports that can help you evaluate previous opportunities, for all of these different kinds of things that are incredibly valuable to the full pipeline. But when you get into it, sorry, I just got a Slack. When you get into it, you don't have as good of tools for dialing, for calling, for being able to see everything you need in one place and quickly turn that into a lot of activities. In my experience, I haven't seen that. And the way that I've gotten around it is I've tried to leverage some of the tactics around blocking off my calendar, right? Every day at different times of the day, I have at least a 1 hour block where I know exactly how many dials I want to make, right? For me, it's 20. I can easily get through 20 dials. Usually, and 20 is kind of a low number for me, but I could easily get through 20 dials in 1 hour. And part of why that number is so low is because my connect rates are pretty good, right? So I'm having decently long conversations. Tactically, I'm blocking off my calendar. That's really hard to do as an AE because stuff happens all the time. If I'm in the middle of my call window and somebody sends me an email being like, hey, I'm ready to sign right now. Can we get this contract done? Obviously, I'm going to drop everything, right? So it's tactically, that's how I'm doing it. And on a process and technology side, I'm also relying on some of the previous tools we had as SDRs that are still available to us as AEs, for us as AEs, but that not everybody uses, right? So in that way, I'm still wearing. I think I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. I feel like a wolf in sheep's clothing, in that I feel like an SDR in AE's clothing right now.
A couple of questions. You give some touch on a lot of great topics. Connect rate. I mentioned a list and spending time on those accounts. As you're looking at it, it's funny because a question that popped up in Outbound Squad with one of our members. She works with 4 to 5 AEs, and one of the things that keeps popping up is account prioritization. Right? She wants to devote time towards the accounts that's going to be more fruitful for the AEs, whether it fit ICP or whatnot. As you're building your list or you're collaborating with AEs, like how are you developing that list of like top A tier accounts, and like what are some things that stand out about those accounts that both you and the AE want to target?
So as an AE now, the biggest way I'm going about prioritizing my accounts are like I have a market segment that I'm sort of focused on, right? And I'm shooting for the companies that are on the high end of my revenue band, right? Like for the sake of an argument, let's pretend that my revenue limit is companies anywhere from zero pre-revenue to 100 million a year. My top accounts are those that have higher annual revenue, and typically it's those where I've been able to check off a couple of boxes where maybe if we've had interactions with them before, that's an account I want to prioritize, right? Even if it might not have been the best kind of interaction, they're familiar with us, right? One, two. Have we since, especially for us, since we work across so many different industries and verticals, I generally try to categorize my accounts based on some of the verticals that are either my strength or really really hot right now. For example, logistics, right? So I'm really focusing on logistics companies maybe that we've interacted with in the past that have a higher annual revenue, right? Those are some of the factors I'm going to be considering. There's a lot that people can do, and it really depends on what does your ideal customer look like based on revenue, number of employees, whatever other criteria, maybe some triggers. Maybe your ideal customer is one that always buys in October. Maybe the customers you've landed before. Maybe your company's existing customers all bought in a given time frame, or they've all bought your solution during a particular trigger of theirs, like maybe they were hiring new people, right? That's a big trigger for us because it means our sales teams are growing. Maybe they were letting people go. That might be a big trigger for you depending on your solution or service, right? Figure out what your triggers are, figure out what your ideal customer's mold is, and then try to fit your accounts into that mold.
Yeah, and systematize that. Once you figure out what those triggers are, like just remove decision making. Build you a little checkbox that you go down. You know what you check, where you look for that information, and when you find those that hit that box, to keep rolling. I love that. We're running out of time a little bit, and I have 2 other quick questions I want to ask you based on stuff you just said there, and maybe we'll have to do another session and talk about some different things. But one thing you mentioned was your connect rate's really good, and that's a problem for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Do you have any tips or tricks or like what you're doing to help with the connect rate there, or things that you found to make that better? Or is it a result of like good prioritization on accounts? Like, can you give us any insight there?
My connect rate is really good because I work at ZoomInfo. I have access to the best phone numbers in the world. Like that's as easy of an answer as you're going to get from me on that one.
Right. Shameless plug. Well, I do have some tips and tricks for everyone that's listening. I will post it up in the show notes that you can leverage there. But I just wanted to see if there are any nuggets. All good. The other question that I wanted to ask you, and this is just simply personal curiosity, Rod, because like I'm familiar with ZoomInfo and what they're doing. You guys have made like quite a few, if I'm not mistaken, like acquisitions of different platforms in the last little bit. As an AE, number one, has that affected you? Like, has leadership tried to add in Hey, we want to push this product, we want to push that product. Every company handles this a little bit differently, and I think a lot of people do it wrong. So, maybe they're doing it really well. But has that affected you? Before we're going to go any further on that, as has it caused any, I don't know, just like hurdles? And then thinking about accounts you're looking at and what you're looking for in accounts, or how's that experience been?
Not me personally. I've only been in AE for a quarter and some change now, right? It hasn't affected me personally. We do acquire companies at a very aggressive rate. So the rate at which you have to stay up to date with not just our suite of products, but also how they relate into one another, and whether two products are standalone or whether now one is a part of the other, or whether they're both incorporated into an overarching thing. There are a lot of moving pieces to keep track of, but that, in my opinion, that's a good problem to have. I'd rather it be tough to keep track of all of my products and services because my company is growing so quickly, acquiring so aggressively, than be intimately familiar with the one thing we have because we haven't changed in 35 years.
Yeah. No.
In my preference, yeah.
Yeah, no, I love the mindset. I think the mindset is half the battle here for most sellers, because this is a complaint we hear. Man, we did this, we changed that, we changed this, but it sounds like if it hasn't affected you personally, then that means ZoomInfo and their leadership is doing a good job of how they're handling that and how that's trickling down to the sales team, which is the real problem that happens here. Like that really should not be the AE's problem. It should be leadership's challenge. Like, all right, we're buying this thing. How are we going to set up the sales org? We're going to hire new reps. We're going to take some reps from that previous, and we're going to keep these siloed for a bit while we figure out how they integrate. And it sounds like they're doing the right thing. So I'm happy.
And I mean, ZoomInfo is Rain King, Discover Org, and ZoomInfo. Those are the biggest acquisitions or mergers that we've done. Not to mention tens of others. So we've gone through a lot of rounds of having to integrate different.
Too, huh?
That's right. Chorus is huge. We've gone through a few rounds of this at this point. So I think we are good at it. I think we are good at communicating it to the teams, making it seamless, both on a messaging as well as like process side. But again, my experience is kind of limited on that.
Yeah. Well, again, kudos to ZoomInfo from Ethan Parker, at least outside looking in. Sounds like you're doing a good job. So, but we're out of time for today. Rod, appreciate you coming on the show. Any thoughts you want to leave folks with? Anything you want to plug? How can they find you? Anything like that?
Follow me on LinkedIn. I'm always doing things like this. I recently did a webinar with Jason Bay and Kyle Coleman, the SVP of Clary. We talked even more tactically about things on a cold call, how to structure your day, some of those things. Follow me on LinkedIn, and if you're a CEO, I might try to sell you, but that's part of the game. But really, but on top of that, I'm happy to be a consultative person. Obviously, I'm going to try to sell you because I'm a salesperson. But if you have questions about data as a whole, it's crazy how few. No, it's even though we have huge market penetration at this point, there's a lot of people that still don't really know how to fully leverage business-to-business data to grow their teams during a time right now when investments in your top-of-the-line revenue growth are huge for your business, right? So if you have questions, hit me up. I might try to sell you, but I'm also going to give you some value. I promise that.
Yep. And I always recommend everyone, ZoomInfo is hands down the best platform you can grab for outbound and data for your company. I'm a huge fan, use it for many years. So appreciate you coming on, Rod, and we'll see everybody next time. Cheers.
I look forward to round 2.
See you, Rod.